What terrifying secrets lie within George's cabin, and what was stalking Keith and Diane's home? High school sweethearts Keith and Diane Williams bought a secluded house on the edge of a forest, but eerie glowing eyes and mysterious tracks would soon disturb their peace. But before we jump in, remember to hit the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications to stay up to date with the channel. Keith and Diane grew up together in the rural town of London, Ohio. High school sweethearts, they married shortly after graduation and have now been together for 6 years. Their 4-year-old daughter, Raven, is their pride and joy. Recently, Diane found a beautiful, secluded home nestled deep in the forest on the outskirts of London. Although it was more isolated than their other options, the privacy and proximity to nature is what appealed to both Keith, who was an avid hunter, and Diane, who also loved the woods. Without hesitation, they bought the house and quickly settled into their new routine, amidst the tranquility of the forest. During this period, Keith was working full-time as a welder during the day and taking night classes to prepare for an apprenticeship program he was eager to join. For 5 days a week, Keith was away for 12 hours straight, leaving Diane home alone with their daughter Raven when she wasn't at school. Diane spent most of her time alone at home. In the first couple of weeks after moving into the new house, Diane had to adjust to spending long hours alone. At night, she began hearing noises that she described as scampering, like an animal moving around outside. Occasionally, she'd glance out the large window above the kitchen sink, which gave her a clear view of the forest behind their home. She assumed it was just a deer, a dog, or some other harmless creature. It didn't worry her, but it was something she noticed during those first few weeks. One night, after putting Raven to bed while Keith was still at night school, Diane was downstairs tidying up and washing the dishes. As she looked out the window, she heard that familiar scampering sound again. With the lights on behind her, a glare reflected off the glass, so she leaned closer to the window pane, trying to spot the deer or dog she suspected was roaming outside. The tree line was close to the house, separated by only 20 or 25 feet, and as she peered out into the darkness, she caught a glimpse of 2 glowing eyes staring back at her. At that moment, she was convinced it was just a dog that had wandered onto their property. Diane wasn't scared. She was accustomed to living near the woods, so she shrugged it off and finished up the dishes. Satisfied, she wandered over to the living room on the other side of the house, leaving the mystery of the glowing eyes behind her. As Diane was tidying the living room, she glanced up at the window facing the opposite direction from the kitchen sink. To her horror, she saw a pair of eyes, at what appeared to be at human level, staring directly through the glass. With the room brightly lit, she couldn't see outside and wondered if her imagination was playing tricks on her. Rushing to the kitchen, she hoped to spot the dog she had seen earlier, thinking it might explain the eyes she'd glimpsed, even if it would have to be unusually tall. But as she leaned closer, almost pressing her face against the glass, a head suddenly appeared on the other side, with glowing golden eyes staring directly at her. Horrified, she stumbled back and almost fell to the floor. Diane scrambled backward across the kitchen floor, trying to escape the terrifying face in the window. Just then, she heard the unmistakable crunch of tires in the driveway. It was Keith. As he entered the house, he found her on the living room floor, wide-eyed and shaken. Diane hurriedly explained what had happened. At first, she thought it was a dog, but now she wasn't so sure. Keith, an experienced hunter, listened and suspected Diane might simply be scared due to the isolation of their new home. Armed with a flashlight, Keith ventured outside to search the property but found no tracks or signs of an intruder. After thoroughly checking the perimeter, he returned inside, unconvinced that it was anything more than Diane's imagination, or perhaps just a random animal outside. He tried to reassure her, thinking the stress of moving to an isolated home near the forest might have caused her to overreact. Despite his comforting words, Diane couldn't shake the eerie image of those glowing eyes staring back at her through the kitchen window. A month went by, and Keith and Diane stopped discussing the eerie encounter. Things have returned to normal. No strange eyes, no scampering sounds. One evening, while Diane was in the kitchen, she looked out the window above the sink. Everything seemed calm, but suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared at the edge of the window, just beyond the tree line. She saw them clearly, and a jolt of terror shot through her as she backed away. Her immediate instinct was to protect Raven. She realized she had to make herself invisible to whatever was lurking outside, and rushed through the house, turning off every light until the entire place was shrouded in darkness. With her heart pounding, she crouched low, peering cautiously out of the darkened kitchen window. The glowing eyes had disappeared, but the fear lingered as she couldn't shake the image of them watching her from the forest. The last light Diane turned off was in the living room. Pressed against the wall, she flipped the switch, plunging the room into darkness. At that moment, she got a clear view through the living room window, where she had seen the eyes a month earlier. This time, a distinct human figure stood pressed against the glass, glowing orange eyes staring directly at her. Horrified, Diane slid along the wall to the kitchen, desperate to reach the landline phone mounted there. Keeping one eye on the window, she caught a glimpse of the figure's shoulder in her peripheral vision. She quickly dialed 911, reporting the presence of someone outside her house who wouldn't leave. As soon as she hung up, she noticed the shoulder slipping out of view. She peeked back into the living room, and sure enough, the figure was gone. Despite the emptiness outside the window, the image of those glowing eyes burned in her mind, leaving her shaken and terrified. Moments later, the flashing lights of a police car lit up the driveway, and she heard a knock at the door. Diane bolted to open it, frantic and hysterical. The officers tried to calm her down and assess the situation. Pointing outside, she insisted that something was lurking around the property. The police immediately began searching the perimeter, scanning the woods and the surroundings for any sign of the elusive figure. When Keith arrived home and saw the police scanning the property, he instinctively knew what had happened. He suspected that Diane had seen the mysterious figure again, or perhaps just a reflection of herself in the glass, leading her to call the police. In this small town, he worried people would think they were overreacting. Regrettably, his frustration boiled over as he confronted Diane, irritated that she had called the cops. He believed there was nothing there, reminding her that he had checked last time and the police were now searching as well. The officers themselves confirmed they hadn't found anything, but assured them they would continue looking for a little longer. Eventually, the police concluded their search, finding no signs of an intruder, and advised Diane and Keith to call again if anything else happened. After the police left, Keith and Diane were left arguing, tensions high between them as Keith dismissed her fears while Diane stood by what she had seen. 4 months would go by without incident. There were no scampering sounds outside, no eyes peering through windows. Keith and Diane had moved past the unsettling ordeal and returned to normal, barely even thinking about it anymore. Even Diane began to believe it had all been in her imagination, perhaps just a product of stress and the isolation of being home alone all the time. By early December 1981, the first big snowfall of winter had arrived, covering the ground in a few inches of snow. One morning, Keith woke up early and, with the family still asleep, decided to head out and bring back donuts and coffee. It seemed like the perfect way to start a peaceful winter day together. It was still dark outside when Keith stepped into the cold, started up his car, and rubbed his tired eyes. Adjusting the rear-view mirror, he suddenly thought he saw someone standing behind his vehicle. Confused, he looked again, but the figure had vanished. He threw the car into park, grabbed his flashlight, and began searching around the driveway, convinced he'd seen someone there. As he wandered around, shining the light into the darkness, he realized the irony of the situation. This was exactly what Diane had experienced. The unsettling certainty of someone outside the house, only for them to disappear without a trace. Had he been wrong to dismiss her fears? He questioned himself as he scanned the shadows, wondering if there was truth in what Diane had seen. Suddenly, he spotted something in the snow, tracks. He couldn't discern exactly what kind of tracks they were, but there were clear prints in the fresh snow. Keith knew where he'd been walking, so he began following the unfamiliar tracks, hoping they would lead to someone or something. The trail led him to the side of the house, where he noticed that the prints stopped abruptly. Confused, he scanned the area, trying to figure out where the intruder could have gone. Then he looked up. There was an extended section of the roof at the first floor level, with the rest of the house rising to the second floor above it. He saw that the tracks went from the ground up to the first floor roof, then continued to the second floor roof, disappearing over the other side of the house. He wondered, who's doing this? What's doing this? Keith hurried to the other side of the house but couldn't find any more prints. The eerie tracks and the vanishing figure left him uneasy, wondering if there was more truth to Diane's fears than he had believed. Keith rushed inside and immediately called his hunting buddy Dennis, the only person who lived nearby. He told Dennis that something strange was happening and that he needed his help. Dennis agreed to come over right away. When Dennis arrived, he found Keith outside with his rifle in hand. Keith showed him the tracks and explained that someone had been on the roof. Dennis listened carefully, trying to make sense of the situation. Suddenly, they both heard a loud thump, as if something had landed heavily from a great height on the other side of the house. Rifles at the ready, the two men sprinted around to the other side and found two distinct footprints in the snow, about 20 feet away from the edge of the roof. Whatever had been on the roof hadn't just jumped 2 stories down, it had leaped 20 feet away from the house as well. The realization left them both unsettled. Keith and Dennis scanned the surroundings cautiously, rifles raised, their minds racing with the implications of such a powerful and agile presence near the house. There were no other footprints, and they had just heard something land before it dashed off into the forest. Dennis and Keith exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. Dennis asked Keith for directions, and without hesitation, Keith said, "Let's go after it." Both men hunted in these woods frequently, so they were familiar with the terrain. Immediately, they noticed that the tracks, about 14 inches long, appeared to belong to a bipedal creature. The footprints indicated movement on 2 legs rather than 4. As they followed the trail deeper into the forest, they wondered how this person or creature had managed to get onto the roof. What kind of animal leaves 14-inch tracks and moves on 2 legs? The mystery was unsettling. They couldn't quite make sense of it. Was it a person or some unknown creature? They didn't know, but they were determined to find out. They followed the tracks into the woods, but the whole time, they had the unsettling feeling of being watched. Occasionally, they would hear something moving through the forest, like a large animal, but they could never reach it in time. After a while, strange noises began echoing from behind them, making them wonder if the creature had somehow managed to loop around and was now tracking them. The feeling of being hunted grew increasingly uncomfortable. Just as they were about to abandon the search, having spent hours following the elusive tracks, they reached a clearing. There, in the middle of the open space, stood a tiny cabin that neither of them had seen before. The tracks led directly to the cabin, stopping right outside the door. Keith and Dennis stood there, staring at the closed entrance, wondering what kind of animal could open and shut doors. Dennis immediately began banging on the door, demanding that whoever was inside come outside. But there was no sound from within, no movement at all. They peered through the windows, but the cabin appeared empty. The eerie silence around them only heightened the sense of dread as they stood there, trying to understand what kind of creature could leave tracks like this and vanish so quickly. Keith quickly realized that the optics of tracking someone to their cabin while carrying guns was not a good look. He and Dennis decided it would be best to leave before the situation escalated. After a few more heated knocks at the cabin door, they turned away and made their way toward a nearby road, guided by the distant hum of traffic. On the road, they found a payphone and called Keith's father, who came to pick them up. When they climbed into the car, Keith's father noticed the rifles and asked about them. Keith and Dennis explained the whole situation and described the mysterious cabin deep in the woods. Keith's father recognized the cabin and knew the occupant, a reclusive older man who worked at a local tire shop. Intrigued by this revelation, Dennis insisted they head to the tire shop to see the man for themselves. Keith was hesitant not to blow things out of proportion, but he and Dennis ultimately decided to bring a beat-up tire to the local tire shop to catch a glimpse of the man who supposedly owned the cabin. At the shop, they noticed that the front desk attendant wasn't the man they were looking for. It was the mechanic in the back. After handing over the tire, the front desk attendant called out to George, who emerged from the shadows to collect the tire, a towering 6'5" older man with distinctive orange eyes. When he glanced up at Keith and Dennis, recognition flashed across his face. He knew these were the 2 men who had tracked him to his cabin. Keith and Dennis watched him intently, convinced that he was the one. George quickly looked away and walked back into the shadows with the tire. Once he had finished working on it, he rolled it back to the middle of the floor, staying out of sight. Keith and Dennis both noted how George remained hidden, seemingly aware that they recognized him. They left the tire shop puzzled. George matched the general description, a large man with distinctive eyes who could have left those 14-inch tracks. But as an older guy, how could he have been climbing onto rooftops? Keith realized he couldn't report this to the police without admitting he'd tracked George to his cabin while armed. There was no clear crime to pin on him anyway. He also didn't want to tell Diane, fearing she'd insist on moving, and he lacked the financial means to do so. So he decided to keep it to himself, hoping he wouldn't encounter George again. For several months, Keith and Diane noticed nothing unusual around their house. However, in March 1982, 3 months after their encounter with George at the tire shop, Dennis arrived at Keith's house with urgent news. Dennis insisted Keith come with him, and soon they were driving toward George's cabin in the woods. Keith grew uneasy, not wanting to confront the man directly. But Dennis revealed that George had died, allowing them to investigate the cabin without interference. Reluctantly, Keith agreed, and they continued toward the cabin, determined to uncover the mystery behind the strange tracks and the unsettling presence around their property. Despite feeling uneasy about it, Keith agreed to check out George's cabin. They drove down the lone access road leading to the cabin but found a police car blocking the way. Dennis recognized the officer and explained the strange circumstances surrounding the cabin and how it connected to their concerns. Initially hesitant to share information, the officer eventually relented and revealed that he was there because of the unusual occurrences at the cabin. He offered to let them take a quick peek inside. Intrigued, Keith and Dennis accepted the offer, eager to uncover what secrets lie within the eerie dwelling. Inside the cabin, they found almost nothing. A chair and a table occupied the tiny space, but there were no personal belongings or food. It was starkly empty, giving the impression of a hermit's minimalist existence. Keith and Dennis assumed this was the strangeness that the cop had mentioned. But the officer pointed out something else, a sheet hanging down inside the cabin. Pulling it aside, he revealed a metal sliding door. As they slid it open, a foul, wet dog smell wafted out, hitting them immediately. Inside was a small cell lined with steel-plated walls, held together with metal strips and rivets. The bizarre setup left Keith and Dennis perplexed, raising more questions about George and what might have been happening in the isolated cabin. The metal-encased room felt like a tomb. In the center of the floor was a 10-foot chain with shackles for both wrists and ankles. The walls were covered in scratch marks, old and new, etched deeply into the steel. The police officer explained that they were trying to figure out what George had been doing with this cell in his secluded cabin. Keith and Dennis left in silence, deeply disturbed by what they'd seen. Driving away, they both knew that whatever had been held in that cage was likely the same thing that had stalked Keith's property and peered through the windows. After George's death, the strange activity ceased. Keith, Dennis, and Diane never learned the true nature of the creature, but Keith noticed that the eerie eyes and unsettling presence never returned to their property. Whatever it was, something had been showing up at Keith and Diane's house, peering through windows, leaving tracks, and even climbing onto their roof. It would then run into the woods and make its way back to George's cabin. Whether it was simply George, some creature from the cage, or something else entirely, remains a mystery. Keith and Dennis never found out for sure, but one thing was certain: the strange activity stopped after George's death and the eerie presence never returned. Did George's death stop the stalking, or was it something more sinister lurking in the woods? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you have made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more, then check out these videos on the screen now. If you have a topic suggestion, please send it to the email in the description. As always, remember to like, comment, share the video, and subscribe to our channel. I will see you in the next one.